Welcome to the CropLife International webinar on pesticides and human health. Our host today is Will Sermon, and if you have questions, he will be summarizing them at the end. My name is Carol Burns. I'm the president of Burns Epidemiology Consulting. By way of introduction, I have a PhD in epidemiology, and what that means is my training is more in math than it is in clinical care. My husband's a physician, which means that he studied how to treat a disease in an individual, whereas my training is understanding patterns of diseases in groups of people and looking for trends and patterns. Today's webinar is to help consumers like you and me to better understand pesticides, their benefits, regulation, and safety. And in turn, I hope that you have enough understanding that you can share this information with others. Let's get started. What is a pesticide? We often want to know that. When we hear the word pesticide, sometimes we think about the insecticides, the killing the bugs and insects. However, the word pesticide is much broader than that and relates to both chemicals and biological agents that deter and incapacitate or kill targeted pests. We forget sometimes that weeds and plants can be pests, particularly when they're invasive to compete with crops for natural resources and growth space. Other pesticides include those that target fungal diseases and rodents like mice and rats that eat harvested and stored crops. It's important to understand that there are both natural and synthetic pesticides. I won't be talking much about organics today, but it is important to understand that all farmers use pesticides, that organic farmers are allowed to use pesticides that are natural. They can also use certain man-made substances like hydrogen peroxide and derivatives of copper and sulfur. Thinking about organic versus non-organic and natural versus synthetic, it's important to understand that just being natural doesn't mean that it's not toxic. If we think about elements of the earth like lead and chlorine, these are not necessarily non-toxic. Pesticides have a global importance. Remember that I studied math and statistics, so I like talking about numbers. The sheer numbers of pests and weeds and worms and insects, to me, is really staggering. Farmers have to use pesticides to grow more food on less land, and it also protects their crops from pesticides and diseases in both the fields and storage. All of this allows for more land for other purposes, such as wildlife and parks. More on numbers and the impact. If we think about it, since the 1960s, the production of major crops has more than tripled, thanks in large part to pesticides. And even with these tools available to many farmers worldwide, up to a quarter or more of crop protection is lost annually because of weeds and pests. Just in the U.S., it's been estimated that without fungicides, the yields of most fruits and vegetables would fall by up to 90%. But what does this mean to us? First and foremost, availability and better production impacts our wallets. Fruits and vegetables are more abundant and more affordable. Even grains, milk, and proteins are more widely available because of lower cost for the animal feed. Secondly, and maybe less obvious, is that pesticides prevent illnesses by preventing microorganisms. For example, there's a mold on corn called aflatoxin, which is a carcinogen. This can be prevented through pesticides. And perhaps most obvious is that pesticides can prevent hunger by increasing crop yields. It's always surprising to me that even today, 1 in 7 people worldwide goes hungry. Pesticides are highly regulated and tested. And this process of testing and regulation is called risk assessment. And each pesticide undergoes its own extensive regulation. In doing so, these tests are the animals and tests are dosed to a point where it causes an outcome. This is called the dose makes the poison. Then the regulators try and back calculate to determine what dose might be appropriate. This is all done to ensure that they don't harm people or other living beings when used correctly. And this term used correctly is important to understand. If you think about all the products on our shelves and in our households, there are many things like toothpaste, laundry detergent, even salt that we don't want to ingest overly. Too much does make a poison. It's important to understand the difference between risk and hazard. By definition, the formula for risk is hazard times exposure. If you think about the example of a shark is very hazardous. It's very dangerous. But for someone like me who lives in the middle of the United States, I'm very far from either ocean. My exposure is zero. That means my risk of a shark attack is similarly zero. There are other examples of items all around us, from food to even sunshine, that have varying degrees of hazard. We intuitively make choices about exposure to control our risk. This time of year, I think about high-fat, high-calorie cookies and cakes that are hazardous to my waistline. But I can reduce my risk of weight gain by eating smaller portions. When pesticides are developed, the scientists will look at maybe an average of thousands and thousands of different chemical molecules. And these are each screened, so those with potential negative effects are screened out from the very beginning. Then the testing begins to bring a new pesticide to market, and it can take up to 10 to 11 years of research and development. It's important to understand that as we test these pesticides, we start with knowledge, and that the studies are run according to international guidelines. An industry or a scientist can't just design a study method to suit a particular outcome, but everything must be agreed upon and validated for reliability across multiple labs. There are about 150 different tests, each with a specific purpose to bring a pesticide to market. Some of these tests are designed to predict the outcomes in humans. There are short-term tests that test things like eye irritation or nausea. Long-term effects look at the entire body and look at effects like cancer or other chronic diseases. And these tests are done for the entire lifespan of the test animal. These tests also take into account sensitive windows of exposure and vulnerable populations such as pregnant women or the elderly. All of this is done to ensure high safety margins. Another focus of these tests is on the wildlife and the environment. This is done to ensure a low impact on the environment, looking at aquatic species, animals, plants, endangered species, and even non-target organisms. Further, the behavior of the pesticide in the environment and how long it takes to break down is also evaluated. After all of this testing, products are only approved for market if it's demonstrated that it does not pose an unacceptable risk. We understand that that term, unacceptable, changes over time. As a result, re-registrations are required on a regular basis across the globe. This can be typically around 10 to 15 year cycle. As a result, today's pesticides tend to be more safe, targeted, and effective. Sometimes products are reviewed and they've decided to be withdrawn from the market. We've seen this with some pesticides because they're determined to cause disease, or they persist in the environment and bioaccumulate in the human body or the wildlife. Other times, the products, their use pattern are changes. This is done to reduce exposure. One very common example is with DDT. DDT is very effective against the mosquitoes that cause malaria. However, because it persists in the environment, it was determined that it should not be used so broadly. However, it still is permitted on a very restricted basis to be used just on the mosquito nets, the bed nets, that are used in malaria endemic areas. So in other words, you can see that sometimes the hazard profile or pesticides are being reduced, the exposure is being reduced and modified so that overall the risk to populations remains low. Talk a little bit about what is a residue and how does this relate to pesticide safety. Even after all of this effort to reduce exposure, sometimes there remain measurable traces of the pesticides on the harvested food crops. Remember, we're talking about low. When I use the term pesticides on food are very low, if you would imagine an Olympic-sized swimming pool and added a few drops into that pool, that concentration is what I mean by very low. There's a term called maximum residue limits, which is important to understand. These MRLs are a trading standard and measure the highest level of a pesticide residue that is legally tolerated when pesticides are exported and imported. The MRLs of importing countries must be met by the exporters or the products are rejected. It's important to understand that there are regulatory standards and that the MRLs are set even lower than those standards to ascertain that foods produced with pesticides are suitable for consumption. Even developing countries are held accountable for MRLs as exporters. So even though they may not test for pesticide residues, they do have to meet the MRLs, ensuring quality produce. Regulators set very strict standards on residues, and safety limits are based on lifetime consumption in the most sensitive and vulnerable populations. And here I'm going to stop because this is where the regulators use their math and statistics. If you imagine that a test animal is given a dose higher and higher and higher until the regulators or the scientists see an effect. That dose is then divided by 10 for sensitive species and 10 again because you're looking at a human to animal species. If we think about what is the level of residue of a pesticide on a produce such as a strawberry, the amount of strawberries that you would have to eat to reach that level that has been established, you'd have to eat 28,000 strawberries every day for your life to have the type of effect seen in the animal studies. So you can see that systems are in place to determine that pesticides are safe and that eating residues are within the safety limits for both conventional and organic produce. In the European Union, for example, about half of all samples are free of detectable residue traces. In the remaining 45%, residues are within legal limits. Only about 2% of items tested exceed these limits, which still does not pose a safety issue because remember, this is based on eating that product every day for the rest of your life. Pesticides are also evaluated for human health. This is where epidemiology comes into play. If you think about this on a more positive note, because pesticides allow us to eat more fruits and vegetables, indirectly, pesticides have a positive impact on our health. It is well established that eating fruits and vegetables reduces our mortality from all causes, And in particular, it prevents diseases like cardiovascular disease and cancer. In all, benefits of consuming fruits, vegetables, and other food crops far outweigh any hypothetical risk of consuming pesticide residues. Now, we do know that pesticides have been proposed as one of multiple risk factors for a number of diseases. A quick Google search will give us a range of diseases and outcomes for which pesticides are suggested. It's important to understand that we need to weigh the exciting, the unique, to the greater volume of studies that don't show an effect, that tend to be more boring and don't make it to social media. To date, the research has shown that there is no causal link between exposure to pesticides and these types of health effects. As an epidemiologist, because I study observational types of studies in humans, I use terms more like association and link than causation. And one of the key components of an epidemiology study is this concept of confounding, that when you study an association, you may not see all of the components that go into that outcome. I'll give you an example. I live in Michigan, and so in Michigan we make cars, we sell cars, we love to drive cars. So I'm going to give you a car example. It's make-believe, but it could be true. You could imagine it. So if you imagine someone who is getting his master's degree and works for the Department of Motor Vehicles, and he looks at the data for auto accidents in the state, and he looks at the color of cars that are involved in these accidents, and lo and behold, red cars are routinely, consistently, and statistically associated with more accidents. And so this very energetic person approaches the state legislature and says, I think we should make a limitation and a ban on the color red to save lives. This is important. Well, there happened to be an epidemiologist who wanted to look more closely at the data. And in doing so, discovered that the people who tend to buy red cars are younger drivers. And the data also indicated that younger drivers, for a variety of reasons, tend to get in more auto accidents and don't drive as safely. So it's not the red car that is associated with auto accidents. It's the components of the age of the driver is associated with red cars and auto accidents, so as a confounder. Because of this, we tend to require that population studies need to be replicated, that a single study alone cannot be conclusive. Furthermore, most studies looking at pesticides to a specific medical condition need to be confirmed by others with the same medical condition. And sometimes it's a little difficult to understand if autism and, say, intelligence don't have the same disease progression. And when we look at a human study that tends to be interesting and exciting, we also don't want to forget the amount of data that is available on that pesticide. All of that laboratory and animal tests also need to be included because they help us understand how the pesticide may interact with the human body. So this is how we can be more conclusive about known cause of any chronic disease and pesticides, because we want to look at all of the evidence across multiple studies. Now we'll move from the laboratory to the field. The evidence is strong that when operators use pesticides responsibly, they do not cause adverse health effects. Remember, we're talking about conditions related to repeated uses and chronic diseases such as cancer, not short-term effects like eye irritation or headaches or even misuse. This means that farmers who follow label instructions and responsibly use pesticides to protect themselves and their farm from adverse health effects. In addition to the required studies for re-registration, there are also voluntary ongoing efforts to study safety of pesticides. Some of these are theoretical, exploring the interaction of genetics and the environment. Some approaches focus just on exposure. These studies quantify the exposure to the applicator with or without protective clothing, exposure to the families, bystanders, and even the general population. Epidemiologists continue to generate studies to compare diseases across populations, both in applicators and the general population. The crop protection industry is committed to ensuring and encouraging farmers to use pesticides only when they're needed and only as much as needed. This approach is called Integrated Pest Management, or IPM. The IPM approach uses pesticides when thresholds of pests, weeds, insects, and so forth are observed, and the product label instructions reinforce these industry recommendations. In all, the IPM approach is a win-win for the farmer and the consumer. Because pesticides incur a cost, reducing less pesticides is good for the farmer. Using less pesticides reduces exposure and increases the safety for both the farmer and the consumer. We talk a lot about farmers following labels, instructions, and responsibly using pesticides. To increase this compliance with the label and understanding, the pesticide industry is committed to encouraging more training. To date, almost 4 million farm workers across the world have been trained. And this training goes beyond just IPM, but also talks about responsible purchase, transport, storage, use, and disposal of pesticides. There's an expression called every drop on the crop, which is good business for the farmer. With cars, particularly in the United States, we're committed to improving driver safety and licensing. But we know that just a good driver, accidents can happen. As a result, the automobile industry is continuing to look at ways to make cars safer. The same is true for the pesticide industry, looking at packaging and training. First of all, the industry lessens the chance of accidents by selling only to trained applicators. But there is a whole range of other activities ongoing to reduce those risks of misuse. There are things like safety seals, childproof caps, vomiting-inducing ingredients prevent accidental or intentional misuse. There are prominent warnings on labels, along with suitably sized and easy-to-handle containers, which discourages decanting. This also protects against counterfeit products, which can be dangerous. This next section talks about the CropLife International website, pesticidefact.org. If I've piqued your interest today and want to learn more about basic information, you can go to this website and learn more about the benefits, testing, regulation, and safety. I didn't have enough time to go into detail about the different evidence for the epidemiology studies on Parkinson's, diabetes, and cancer. There are summaries of this research also on the website. There are perspectives by a range of experts, from epidemiologists to toxicologists, talking about pesticides and safety and human health. And lastly, the website is an excellent resource for scientific literature as well as an Ask the Expert box. In the end, it all comes down to what we can do ourselves. If you have concerns about residues or pesticides, it's important to understand that all you have to do is focus on washing your produce. We know that produce comes along with dirt and microorganisms, and even organic foods can have traces of pesticides. Simply rub the produce under water with clean hands or a clean brush will remove most of any pesticides and dirt. Remember, we started with small levels. This can reduce this small level to really small. This time of year, I like to focus on staying healthy and reducing the risk of disease to myself and my family. I find it easier to focus on doing more rather than eating less. I like to focus on to do more for good nutrition to eat 5 servings a day. At our house, we try to eat a fruit in the morning and a fruit and vegetable at lunch and a fruit and vegetable at dinner. There are certain websites that have watch lists, Dirty Dozen, other food lists to tell us what we should not eat. Instead of worrying about this, I try to focus more about finding recipes and tricks to get my kids to like kale and Brussels sprouts and other vegetables. I know that scientifically, the risk of disease and problems from very trace residues is hypothetical and low at best. This time of year, again, because I live in Michigan and it's snowing outside, I can't get fresh market vegetables. So I try to eat fruits and vegetables in any form, both frozen and canned, to continue to get more servings a day for good nutrition. If you have questions about more questions about pesticides, please go to science-based websites and pesticidesorgs.com. In summary, the benefits of pesticides are many. Pesticides help farmers to grow more food on less land. We have extensive knowledge on pesticides and their safety. And this is because they're tested and strictly regulated across the globe. Residues are tiny. Testing shows that they are typically well within safety limits and do not pose a health risk. Operators are trained to work safely, and in fact, studies show they have lower incidences of most cancer and greater longevity than the general populations. As a result, pesticides have a positive impact on our health. At this time, I'll turn it over to Will, who has summarized the questions online, and we will go to the question and answer period.